Have the Detroit Red Wings improved enough to finally end their long playoff drought? Can the New Jersey Devils take the next step forward? And are the Seattle Kraken headed in the right direction? We're going to answer those questions and a lot more on today's Locked On NHL podcast.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Gil Martin here. Welcome, everybody, to the Monday episode of the Locked On NHL podcast. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank everyone who makes Locked On NHL your first listen every day. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts so you never miss an episode. This episode is brought to you by Monarch Money. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNHL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. It is my pleasure to welcome back to the show the co-host of Locked On Red Wings, Brian Fisher. And Brian, you know, it's been an interesting offseason in Detroit. I know there was talk that Steve Yzerman wanted to make a big splash move. The fans certainly wanted him to make a big splash move. But what do you think of the moves he did make this offseason?
Well, I think he avoided missteps. When the free agency market dwindles the way it does before noon on June 1st even hits, a lot of NHL GMs, and Yzerman himself has even done this in the past, I feel, will rush to give out bad contracts to players in an effort to get whatever's left. Yzerman committed to not doing that this year. So the players he did sign, I like. James Van Riemsdyk is going to bring a net front presence to the bottom six. He's older now. He's not the James Van Riemsdyk of old, but he's going to be able to deflect a lot of shots down low. He's going to be able to get to the net, get to the dirty areas. He's going to bring a scoring touch to the bottom six that they did not have. Mason Appleton has a guy who can move the puck up ice. He shoots the puck a lot. He's play a little bit of special teams. He's just a bottom six body. Again, another guy you're not overpaying for. Jacob Bernard-Docker, I actually like a lot. I think he's probably the sleeper acquisition of the offseason. A lot of Buffalo Sabres fans were not thrilled when they let him walk they didn't qualify him. So as an RFA, they just let him walk out the door. He has an offensive upside to his game, which could come in handy on the third pair. But you Travis Hamonic, the newest guy in the block, like 1 year, $1 million. He's probably going to be, I would hope, is like an AHL call-up guy to compete and maybe compete for the third pair. But the problem isn't, while I like the signings they made, he stayed calm. He didn't overspend on guys that were middle of the lineup, bottom of the lineup players. They got marginally better in those areas because of those acquisitions. Likely, they also didn't get the needle moving guy. And that's not 100% his fault, right? This offseason with the rising cap, everyone had the money to keep the players that they had. A lot of teams decided the demons that we know are better. The grass is not always greener on the other side. Pick an analogy, right? So Brock Besser stayed. Aaron Ekblad, who I know I had heard the Red Wings had interest in, Windsor native, right across the pond, so to speak, from the Detroit Red Wings. He stayed. Sam Bennett stayed. Like all the guys that you would want to pursue as big time free agents didn't leave, or in Mitch Marner's case, were dealt to another team and signed before free agency hit. So I'm not upset about this free agency in a vacuum. It's more about the entirety of the work that is kind of bothersome to me at this point, because this team still has massive holes, and in an incredibly competitive division like the Atlantic is, with Ottawa and Montreal both making the leap back to playoff teams last season, you need a needle-moving move to ensure you are comfortably in that conversation.
Another addition they made, obviously, John Gibson coming in to add depth to the goaltending situation. How are you feeling about that acquisition?
I mean, Gibson's comfortably the best move that they made all offseason. You look at what they gave up. They gave up Peter Mrazek, who they got at the deadline beforehand. He was all right before he got hurt, but this team really needed to stabilize goaltending. Now, this isn't John Gibson of a decade ago where he was getting Vezina votes. And I know he's gone through some ebbs and flows since then, battling injury and then also being on a very bad Ducks team. But this last season showed a lot of reason to believe that there is still a little bit of old John Gibson in there. He had a very impressive season, I think a .917 save percentage in a year with a average save percentage was like .905. Granted, in a smaller sample size, I know he was the backup goalie to Dostal, but if he can come in here and give the Red Wings 47 games at a 9.5, 9.10 clip, somewhere in that range, then he will have done his job and come in here to solidify the net and allowing Cam Talbot, because part of what made Cam Talbot falter last season was that the Red Wings had no choice but to overwork him, because Alex Lyon wasn't up to snuff, Peter Mrazek wasn't up to snuff, but they wore Talbot into the ground. So if Gibson can come in, alleviate some of the pressure from 38-year-old Cam Talbot, that as a whole should make their goaltending a lot more consistent, and that in and of itself could offer the Red Wings 2, maybe 4 more points next season. And we know that 5 points was all they missed the playoffs by, so you're on your way there. Gibson definitely has the biggest upside, but I also think that he has probably the biggest downside of all of the players that they acquired if he can't stay healthy, or if last year wasn't a true return to form and rather a flash in the pan.
What are your biggest concerns? You talked about this team still having many needs. Here we are about a month away from the start of preseason action. What are the biggest concerns you have about this team?
Biggest concern right now is definitely defense. You know, we talk on the podcast too about needing one more. You need a top line left wing. You just do not have it right now. You have 5 top 6 forwards, but honestly, the biggest need of them all is second pair. Because of the fact that this team lacks defensive depth so bad, you were forced to split up Edvinsson and Seider to just give your second pair a chance at being decent. And Edvinsson was very good. I mean, I do think similarly to Talbot near the end of the season, because remember, Edvinsson last year was a rookie, functionally a rookie. Technically he wasn't, but it was his first full season in the NHL. And he was playing with another rookie in Albert Johansson. So by the end of that season last year, they were kind of getting caved in because they weren't used to that long of a season, that big of an assignment at the NHL level. I do think it'll get better this year as both of them take a step forward. But you look at it, and Albert Johansson's a nice player. I think he's their best option right now on the right side of the second pair. But in a playoff team, he's probably a good third pair defenseman. So you want in the long term to pair up Seider and Edvinsson too. And Sherratt is honestly not a top pair defenseman. He's being asked to do, I know he's one of those players that the Red Wings fans also like to kind of rag on. He's being asked to do way more than he should at this point in his career. But they don't have any other options. That's why it's the biggest problem. You have one pair that can play top pair minutes, and you have to split them up in order to make the second pair playable, which then makes the first pair work. And God bless Moritz Seider, because he's tasked to do with some of the hardest minutes, hardest deployments, and basically do it on his own on that top pair. But you miss on Keandre Miller, because that was a player that they were really in the conversation with, but Carolina offered a slightly better package. So you missed out on that. Brent Burns, who I was, even at 41 years old, a 1-year deal, I'd have taken him just as a filler piece, a Band-Aid, went to Colorado. And then Gavrikov knew he was going to New York Rangers a month ago. Like, there just was no one available. Aaron Ekblad stayed in Florida. Like, they missed out. They didn't even have the opportunity to miss out on all these players, with the exception of 41-year-old Brent Burns. So it's just, they have huge holes. And if they don't make the playoffs, it'll be because of the defensive core. I feel more than anything, there'll be a lot of different reasons. It's not ever one person's fault, but I think that'll be the big eyesore, the big sore spot for them. And I don't know how Yzerman fixes it. Sitting here on August 17th as we record, I don't know how Yzerman fixes it, because he said at the end of free agency, when he was done, like a week later, he had his media availability. He says, I'm going to, reconvene with the other GMs and see what their needs are to be filled. But this is the downside of the rising cap. Teams aren't in cap hell. They're not forced to shed players. So to get a player from a team, you're going to have to massively overpay. And Yzerman, with where this prospect pool is out, he's not going to do that. And I wouldn't want him to do that, because there's a difference between, being aggressive and being stupid. So I'm not trying to make up excuses for Steve Yzerman because this is the team of his own making at this point. It's been since, we just talked about it before we hit record, since 2019. This is his roster. He has blame on his shoulders for where this roster is at. But in the vacuum of this offseason, I understand how hard it is to make this team better. You know, there's 30 teams in the NHL on July 1st that were asking, how did we make our team better through free agency? And there's maybe two teams that can say, yes, we did.
Yeah, not an easy thing as we enter year 7 of the Yzer plan. Brian, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you and your co-host on social media?
You can find the podcast on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, Odyssey, anywhere you listen to podcasts. It's Locked On Red Wings, obviously. You can find me on social media, on X or Blue Sky, at Brian Fisher, LORW for both. Scotty is at Bentley Scotty on both. Please give us a listen. We're doing player previews right now, so we're talking about every single player on the roster. Peak offseason form right now. Talking about every player on the roster and what you can hope to expect from them in the 25-26 years. The Red Wings try to break their playoff drought.
All right, Brian, thank you so much.
Of course. Thanks for having me, Gil.
Today's episode is brought to you by Monarch Money. Most people can't name all their financial accounts or even what they're worth, whether it's 401ks, properties, or investments. And when you don't have the full picture, you can end up leaving money on the table. That's why there's Monarch Money. It's an all-in-one personal finance tool that brings your entire financial life together in one clean, easy-to-use interface on your laptop or on your phone. Monarch does the heavy lifting for you. You can link all your accounts in minutes, see clear data visuals, get smart categorization of your spending, and finally feel in control of your money without ever touching a spreadsheet. I linked all my accounts to Monarch and immediately spotted a few subscriptions I wasn't even using. Canceling those alone saved me money every month. So don't let financial opportunities slip through the cracks. Use code LOCKEDONNHL at monarchmoney.com in your browser for half off your first year. That's 50% off your first year at monarchmoney.com with code LOCKEDONNHL. It is my pleasure to welcome back to the show the host of Locked On New Jersey Devils, Trey Matthews, and hope the summer is treating you well, Trey. It's been an interesting summer for the Devils. What about their offseason moves has excited you the most?
Oh, well, I'll be honest with you, Gil. I don't think the word excited is the correct terminology. I mean, look, if I had to rate the Devils offseason, I would give them a C. That, if I'm being completely honest, they didn't make the team significantly better, but they didn't make the team significantly worse. I'm pretty neutral about it. If I'm being completely honest, the Devils are still going to be a playoff team because I think you know this as well as anyone. The Metro, not really the strongest division in the NHL, so I'm not really concerned about the Devils' playoff chances. But in terms of being a Stanley Cup contender, look, we've been saying it for the past few seasons. They have the right assets, but I sound like a broken record when I say this. Can it materialize? Can they stay healthy? Can they put everything together to really push this team forward?
You mentioned staying healthy. Let's touch on Jack Hughes because his injuries seem to have derailed the team last year, especially. Will he be ready for training camp and for the regular season?
Yes. Tom Fitzgerald has confirmed that Jack Hughes will be good to go. He said that Brendan Dillon also making significant progress. Luke Hughes, Jesper Bratt, all those guys I just listed had to get some work done over the offseason to repair some injuries. That's how the Devils met their demise during the playoffs. The only player that will not be good to go to begin the season is Jonathan Kovacevic. He is scheduled to go onto the LTIR, and I don't think we're going to see him until like maybe December, January, and who knows, maybe after the Olympic break, depending on how everything unfolds. But Jonathan Kovacevic is the only Devils player who is right now not slated to begin the season.
Now, you mentioned Luke Hughes, and there is a little contract situation going on. Why don't you update us on that?
Yeah, so Luke Hughes His entry-level contract has expired. The good news is, and I don't know if this is good news for other NHL teams, he cannot be given an offer sheet by other teams. So that's why you're not hearing arbitration, things like that. The Devils still have that kind of power. The problem is it still has not come into fruition. And we're now over 40 days, Gil, since Tom Fitzgerald spoke to the media and told us that re-signing Luke Hughes was his main priority. Look, I've traveled to Europe. I have moved out of my apartment in Florida. And despite all of that, still nothing. So I have made more moves than Tom Fitzgerald has when it comes to Luke. So yeah, that's where we're at right now, but I'm not concerned about it. It will get done. Devils still have that kind of power, but yeah, I mean, it's just incredible that 40 plus days later, there's still no contract extension for Luke Hughes.
Is it straight up about money at this point?
It could be. I mean, look, I don't want the Devils to sign him to a bridge deal. Otherwise, you're going to put yourself into a very uncomfortable position because, believe it or not, Captain Nico Hischier, he only has 2 years remaining on his contract. So he will become a UFA. And if you re-sign Luke Hughes to a bridge deal, here are your problems. Now you got to worry about Luke. You got to worry about Nico. I think the Devils want to put themselves in the running for Quinn Hughes when he becomes a UFA in 2027. And to add to that, if Luke develops the way that we anticipate, he could demand even more money. So you got to lock him up long-term, no bridge deals. His contract, it could follow a similar outline as Brock Faber. Maybe we'll see how that comes to be. But for right now, Luke Hughes still does not have a contract, but I'm not really going to put any fear out there because he will be a Devil to start next season.
I've heard some trade rumors about Andre Palat. Anything you can tell us about where that's at and what his future looks like with the team?
The Devils are looking to clear some cap, and I think they want to move on from Palat because he's a solid player, great forechecker, elevates his game come playoff time, but he is not worth $6 million annually. So I think the Devils are trying to unload that contract, and they're trying to take a playbook out of the Rangers front office, which is how do you get rid of guys that have big time contracts to clear up some cap. But unfortunately, no luck. And it's worth mentioning that Palat does have trade protection. He has a modified no movement clause. So he has 10 teams that he doesn't want to be dealt to. And some of the teams over the offseason that were looking to reach the cap floor, not the cap ceiling, the cap floor, you got like Chicago, Anaheim, I believe San Jose. But for Palat, he's only played on playoff caliber teams. And no disrespect to any of those teams that I just listed, but I don't think a multi-time champion like Andre Palat wants to go to a team that is still rebuilding and still a few years removed from getting back to the playoffs. And look, I wouldn't mind being dealt to California if I'm Andre Palat, but that's just me, or going to an original 6 team like Chicago. But I'm not in his shoes. I get it. He probably wants to still win despite being on the other side of his better days. But for right now, Andre Palat still remains a member of the Devils. And this is just me speculating, but as soon as the Luke Hughes extension comes to fruition, I think what you see is going to be the 2025-2026 New Jersey Devils roster.
Do you think they could maybe try to retain some salary to deal Palat?
I mean, I think they could. I mean, look, I know the Rangers, they unloaded some big contracts the last few months, and I don't think they had to retain much, if any. But for the Devils, look, if you're trying to get rid of Palat, I'm all for it. But if you got to retain, then to sweeten the deal, I would do it. But here we are. Andre Palat, still a member of the Devils. No disrespect to him. Definitely a underrated asset on the Lightning's championship runs. But Based on what we were talking about over at Pucks and Pitchforks, which is the site I work at, I think Andre Palat is making it a little difficult because of the trade protection that he has.
So what are your biggest concerns about this team with training camp less than a month away?
I think my biggest concern is the same concern that I've had the past few years. Can this team stay healthy? That's just the big thing, because that's what ended them during the playoffs. Jack Hughes went down shortly before the trade deadline. So it was just like, well, Devils just lost their star player. So are they going to become buyers? They're not going to become sellers. What do? They get some solid additions, but nothing to really jump out of your seat about. And come the playoffs, they lost Luke Hughes. They lost Brendan Dillon. They had to put their trust in Jonas Siegenthaler and Dougie Hamilton, who were also trying to recover from their respective injuries. They put a lot of pressure on Jacob Markstrom's shoulders. The thing that I just need to see from the Devils is please stay healthy. Jack has got to appear in at least 75 games this year. That's all I'm asking for, because if he suffers another big shoulder injury, you might need to have an uncomfortable conversation, but that's worst case scenario. I'm not even going to talk even more about it because I don't want to even manifest that.
Totally understand that. Trey, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
You can find me on X at TreyMatt4. You can also find the show on X at Locked On Devils. You can listen to Locked On Devils wherever you get your podcast from. You can also watch it on YouTube. Closing in on 3,000 subscribers, a few hundred away. Would love some help. But yeah, that's where you can find my materials. You can also view my written work on Fansided with Pucks and Pitchforks.
All right, Trey, thanks so much.
Thank you, Gil.
It is my pleasure to welcome back to the show a familiar face and voice for Locked On NHL listeners and viewers, Erica L. Ayala of Locked On Kraken and of the weekly Women's Hockey Spotlight. Erica, great to have you here, and it certainly hasn't been quiet this offseason in Seattle, and kind of exciting because The Athletic, among other publications, listed the Kraken as one of the teams that improved the most in the league over the offseason. How excited are you about some of these additions?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting that we're up there with most improved. I think that around Kraken land, we're still trying to figure out what the long-term plan is for the organization. I know the team tank talks were heavy in rotation on Locked On Kraken towards the back end of last season. And although I think there are some improvements, if you look at things like having a net front presence, you look at things like special teams, in particular, looking at the penalty kill, I think you can see where there's some grit and toughness in some of the additions that we have, some players that maybe can win some puck battles for the Seattle Kraken this upcoming season. But there are some things that are, again, still up in the air. The organization committed to Philip Grubauer, which was not something that we thought we would be talking about coming into season 5. It just seemed like the writing was on the wall, including an AHL stint with Gruby last year. But he is going to be an Olympian. He's one of the 6 named for Team Germany. So that also does give the Seattle Kraken, especially with how things have worked out with a few changes in the league, an option to keep another goalie on. And that's exactly what they're going to do, because we're expecting Joey Daccord to be the number 1 again. I think, we're looking for Chandler Stevenson to kind of have a more consistent season. I thought at the on the other side of the trade deadline, I think we started to see the promise there, but it took a little while. And defensively, he wasn't always sound for the Seattle Kraken team. So yes, I think there were some moves. They weren't splashy, And the Kraken, I think last year, coming into last year's season 4 for us, they were the splashiest moves, comparative to the Kraken. But this year, it's a little bit more of maybe getting a player that's more plug and play, but can maybe, if you look at statistically on paper, can maybe move the needle a little bit more in the grit area. And that's because these are veterans with some size and experience.
How are you feeling about Mason Marchment being added to this lineup?
Yeah, I think it's been interesting to hear fans of Mason talk about Mason Marchment. And again, they like the idea, the concept. He fits into what the Seattle Kraken are trying to do. We have had some viewers pop in multiple times and say, hey, great pickup, just keep him out of the sin bin.
Yeah.
So,
little details.
Yes, minor details. And so that is something, is it a return to like Carson Soucy land, maybe a little bit there for us. I'm not really bothered by that because as Locked on Kraken listeners know, I think we need a little sandpaper. We need a little grit to our game. And so Mason Marchment can do that. So many M's. Mason,
say that 10 times fast, right?
Exactly. Mason Marchment can do that for us for sure. And I think, again, he is one of those players when I was talking net front presence, he's going to offer that in spades. And so if you think about what Jaden Schwartz has been able to do, who, if we really think about guys that get in front of the net, Jaden is probably undersized, but he has that ability. He has that knack. He has a good feel for when he needs to be around the net. I think that we've seen other players be able to step that up. But that's where I think Mason steps in. I think also looking at what he can potentially do on special teams is going to be huge. And then there's a big thing here. One of the goals for the Kraken was to be, quite bluntly, not terrible on the second game of a back-to-back in particular. We had abysmal numbers. We won 0 games on the second game of a back-to-back. And that was only for the season. I think we're upwards of 14, 16 of losses consecutive if we even go back to the season prior. So that's a huge thing. And for me, that's a little bit of conditioning. That's staying healthy, which we know no team can guarantee in hockey or in sport overall, but especially a sport like hockey. And then that also comes down to discipline and being able to utilize players in the right way. So I think Mason, I don't know what stat you look at to see if a guy can help you win back to the second game of a back-to-back. But again, Mason has a lot of the makeup of what our new general manager, Jason Bottrell, is trying to build this Kraken team to be.
You also have a new coach, Lane Lambert, someone I'm familiar with from his time with the New York Islanders. What are your early perceptions of him, and can he help with this team doing better on the back end of back-to-backs?
He knows it's a goal. Again, it's not a secret. It was very talked about on Locked on Kraken last year. And so when there's a coaching change, that was something of paramount importance and a way immediately that this team can find some wins. And we've broken, the math down on Locked on Kraken, and that's huge. What I think Lane Lambert can offer, and I think it goes to back-to-backs, it goes to special teams, it goes to even a team that regressed defensively last season, is that he has, I think, will be able to bring structure. And from everything that I've heard, small sample size, as you know, Gil, when it comes to head coaching experience, but he's helped build very successful teams as part of a coaching staff. And yes, the head coach usually gets the glory, or they get the heartache, the pain, all of the blame. But, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes head coaches will place certain assistants or associate coaches and have them oversee specific areas of the team. And Lane Lambert From everything that we've heard, multiple stops that he's had, including most recently with Toronto, that's been something where he's been able to make an impact. And so again, that's huge. I also think that Lane, he's been around the NHL. His reputation is very good from what I understand. He's very well respected. Again, had a little bit of a blemish in New York with the Islanders. As you and I have talked about, that might have just been situation and circumstance, not enough of a departure from the previous administration, so to speak. So I'm curious to see, now that he's coming in with much more of a clean slate, if he can bring some of that discipline, if he can bring some of the, the respect and the revere that his body of work brings, and that it just elevates, right, everything that Seattle is doing. I don't think that should have been an issue under Dan Bylsma, but maybe it was like what we talked about with Lane. Dan was so connected to that Coachella Valley team, and then bringing that on board, you do want a seamless team. And also sometimes when you're making a change, it has to be clear that things are going to change. So I think Lane Lambert is going to be able to bring that for sure.
Yeah, I think he'll have a very good chance of being able to implement that. So where is this team right now? What are the realistic expectations for the Kraken in 2025, 2026?
Yeah, so we've been debating this on Locked On Kraken because incrementally, because of the coaching staff, some of the players that we've already talked about, this should be a better team incrementally. It shouldn't be too difficult to be a better team than last year. There were just a lot of lapses. Again, the back-to-back record, abysmal. The power play had brushes of brilliance, as I sometimes like to say, but way too inconsistent. The penalty kill, all you got to do is hang on to the puck until the last 5 seconds and you'll probably score on the Kraken. Like, that's kind of what we were dealing with. So those are things that you want to refine, that you want to brush up. That being said, the thing that I've been talking about, not just coming into this season, Gil, but as a franchise that enters the Pacific Division, what we know is, and I referred to Team Tank before, we've got some Team Tankers in the Pacific Division, bona fide card-carrying president emeritus of the Team Tank. Even if we're marginally better, right, the Seattle Kraken, if the rest of the division is getting better and we can't crank it up, then yeah, we're going to find ourselves right back in the same place. And the difficulty with the Seattle Kraken, and why some fans maybe want to lean into, if this roster isn't going to win, focus on system. And maybe you don't say you're tanking, but you're okay if you are. And that's because we're in the messy middle right now when it comes to our play and our performance on the ice, but maybe even more importantly, when it comes to how we, as an organization that is seen to have a very good pipeline, if we can't find room for these guys, because we've got 2 guys on a 7-7 contract, who aren't the top 2 players on our team, even though they're getting paid like they should be. My gut is telling me that we're going to stay in that messy middle. It will be the marginal, incremental gains that we'll have from a franchise perspective. I don't think that that's going to favor very well when it comes to competing in the division or even throughout the NHL.
All right, Erica, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
Indeed. Well, of course, as part of the Locked On Podcast Network, you can find Locked On Kraken on all audio platforms. You can also find us on YouTube. I mean, if you use Fubo TV or some of these other streaming channels, you can even sometimes just pop there. And if there's a bubble for the Kraken, you might see us there. And the show, we're using mostly TikTok, so at Locked On Kraken for that. And as Gil mentioned, you can hear me on Saturdays as your co-host of the Women's Hockey Report, our weekly women's hockey podcast.
All right, Erica, thank you so much.
Thank you, Gil.
I want to thank my guest, Brian Fisher of Locked On Red Wings. I want to thank Trey Matthews of Locked On New Jersey Devils and Erica Ayala of Locked On Kraken for joining me today. I'm Gil Martin. I host the Monday edition of Locked On NHL, and I co-host the Friday edition along with Rachel Donner. Don't forget, we're here at Locked On NHL 6 days a week, bringing you the biggest stories from around the hockey world all year long. So hit the like button and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Have a great day, everybody. Stay safe, and thanks so much for listening to and watching the Locked On NHL podcast.